Global powers and developments refer to the ways states use their influence and evolving political, economic, and technological capacities to shape how global issues are addressed and resolved. The different types of political power that can be used by states are soft and hard. Hard power is the use of the military and economic policy to influence other political bodies. Hard power is used as a means of forcing compliance by threatening or applying military action or economic sanctions. An example of this is Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, where military force was used to achieve political objectives. The use of hard power is effective as it can influence other states quickly, deters other states from opposing through fear, and demonstrates credibility and the ability to find and enact solutions. This is shown in the US-led military campaign against ISIS by 2017, which significantly reduced the group's territorial control through sustained force. However, the use of hard power is ineffective as it can provoke resistance, can damage the state's reputation, and can be costly in lives and resources. This is shown in the US withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021, where prolonged military involvement failed to create lasting political stability. Soft power is the ability to shape the preferences of others using diplomatic and cultural techniques. Soft power is used as a way of building cooperation and legitimacy by promoting values, culture, and positive international relationships. An example of this is the United States rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement in 2021, where diplomacy was used to influence other states to cooperate. The use of soft power is effective as it can build cooperation, improves the state's reputation, is less costly, and can create sustainable influence. This is shown in the European Union's diplomatic unity and cultural influence used to coordinate international support for Ukraine since 2022. However, the use of soft power may be ineffective as it's slower, can be ignored, and cannot be enforced. This is shown in China's use of Confucius Institutes over the last decade, where concerns over political influence have led some countries to close them. State power is classified as the level of influence and capability a state has to shape international outcomes and global decision-making. The different classifications of state power are great powers, superpowers, and emerging powers, based on their military, economic, and diplomatic influence. Great powers are states with substantial military strength, large economies, and significant diplomatic influence, but without total global dominance. An example: a state with great powers is the United Kingdom, as it has a strong military, a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, and major diplomatic reach. Great power states are significant in global affairs as they shape international law, influence global security, and play leading roles in international organizations. This is shown in the UK and France coordinating diplomatic and military support for Ukraine since 2022. However, great power states may not be significant as their influence can be constrained by economic decline, reliance on alliances, and competition from stronger states. This is shown in the UK's reduced global influence following Brexit negotiations from 2016 onwards. Superpowers are states with overwhelming military, economic, and cultural influence that allows them to project power on a global scale. An example: a state with superpowers is the United States, as it has the world's largest economy, extensive military bases worldwide, and strong cultural influence. Superpower states are significant in global affairs as they dominate international security, shape global economic systems, and influence international norms and values. This is shown in the United States leading NATO support for Ukraine following Russia's invasion in 2022. However, superpower states may not be significant as they face overstretch, domestic political division, and growing resistance from rival states. This is shown in the US withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021, which highlighted limits to long-term military influence. Emerging powers are states whose economic and political influence is rapidly increasing but is not yet fully established globally. An example: a state with emerging powers is India, as it has fast economic growth, a large population, and increasing regional and global influence. Emerging power states are significant in global affairs as they reshape global economic patterns, influence regional stability, and challenge existing power structures. This is shown in India's expanding role in the G20, including hosting the summit in 2023. However, emerging power states may not be significant as they often face internal inequality, limited military reach, and dependence on existing global systems. This is shown in Brazil's economic instability since 2016, which has limited its ability to sustain global influence. Polarity is the way power is distributed across the international system between states. There are three different polar structures, which are unipolarity, bipolarity, and multipolarity. Unipolarity, or hegemony, is where a single state holds a dominant position in military, economic, and political power. The implications of a state having a unipolarity structure are greater global influence, the ability to shape international institutions, and responsibility for maintaining global stability. An example of a unipolarity state is the United States, as it has unmatched military reach, economic influence, and cultural power on a global scale. Bipolarity is where power is concentrated between two dominant states that compete for influence. The implications of a state having a bipolarity structure are increased rivalry, clearer alliance systems, and a higher risk of tension between the two leading powers. An example of a bipolarity state is the United States and China, as both dominate global trade, military capability, and political influence while competing directly with each other. Multipolarity is where power is spread across several significant states rather than concentrated in one or two. The implications of a state having a multipolarity structure are greater cooperation, more complex alliances, and increased uncertainty in global decision-making. An example of a multipolarity state is the European Union, as its collective economic strength and diplomatic influence rival other major global powers. World order is the overall structure of relationships between states where power, rules, and institutions shape how countries interact, cooperate, and resolve conflict at the international level. The nature of world order has changed since 2000 as power has become more dispersed among emerging and regional powers. This is shown in the growing influence of China through initiatives such as the Belt and Road Initiative over the last decade. However, the nature of world order has not changed since 2000 as the United States remains the most dominant global military and economic power. This is shown in the United States leading international sanctions and military support for Ukraine since 2022. There are many different systems of government, including democratic, semi-democratic, non-democratic, autocratic states, failed states, and rogue states, which shape how states interact within global order. A democratic government is a system where political power is derived from the people through free and fair elections. The characteristics of a democratic government are regular elections, the rule of law, protection of human rights, separation of powers, an independent judiciary, and freedom of the media. An example of a democratic government is Germany, as it holds competitive elections, protects civil liberties, and operates under a strong constitutional framework. The positive impact of democratic states on global order is the promotion of cooperation, stability, and international law, which is shown in Germany's leadership role within the European Union during the response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine since 2022. However, a negative impact of democratic states on global order is policy inconsistency caused by electoral change, which is shown in the United States shifting foreign policy priorities between administrations over the last decade. A semi-democratic government is a system where elections exist but democratic freedoms and checks on power are limited. The characteristics of a semi-democratic government are restricted media freedom, weakened judicial independence, regular but flawed elections, limits on opposition parties, and concentration of executive power. An example of a semi-democratic government is Hungary, as it holds elections but has reduced media freedom and weakened checks on executive authority. The positive impact of semi-democratic states on global order is their ability to provide regional stability and economic cooperation, which is shown in Hungary's continued participation in European Union decision-making since 2015. However, a negative impact of semi-democratic states on global order is the erosion of democratic norms, which is shown in European Union disputes with Hungary over rule of law concerns since 2018. A non-democratic government is a system where political power is not gained through free and fair elections and public participation is limited. The characteristics of a non-democratic government are one-party rule, limited political freedoms, state control of the media, repression of opposition, and weak accountability. An example of a non-democratic government is China, as political power is controlled by a single party and opposition is not permitted. The positive impact of non-democratic states on global order is their capacity for rapid decision-making and economic coordination, which is shown in China's large-scale infrastructure investment through the Belt and Road Initiative over the last decade. However, a negative impact of non-democratic states on global order is the undermining of human rights and international norms, which is shown in international criticism of China's actions in Xinjiang since 2017. An autocratic government is a system where power is concentrated in the hands of a single leader or a small elite. The characteristics of an autocratic government are limited political participation, strong control over the media, repression of dissent, weak legislative oversight, and long-term leadership. An example of an autocratic government is Russia, as political power is centralized under President Putin and opposition is heavily restricted. The positive impact of autocratic states on global order is the ability to act decisively in foreign policy, which is shown in Russia's rapid military mobilization in Syria prior to 2016. However, a negative impact of autocratic states on global order is increased instability and conflict, which is shown in Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. A failed state is a state where the government has lost effective control over its territory and cannot provide basic services. The characteristics of a failed state are weak central authority, widespread violence, economic collapse, lack of public services, and humanitarian crises. An example of a failed state is Somalia, as its government has struggled to control territory and provide security since the collapse of central authority. The positive impact of failed states on global order is increased international cooperation in humanitarian intervention, which is shown in United Nations and African Union peacekeeping efforts in Somalia since 2016. However, a negative impact of failed states on global order is the spread of terrorism and regional instability, which is shown in ongoing attacks by Al-Shabaab in East Africa over the last decade. A rogue state is a state that is perceived to threaten international peace by violating international law and norms. The characteristics of a rogue state are pursuit of weapons of mass destruction, defiance of international agreements, aggressive foreign policy, isolation from the international community, and heavy sanctions. An example of a rogue state is North Korea, as it continues to develop nuclear weapons in defiance of United Nations resolutions. The positive impact of rogue states on global order is increased international cooperation among other states to contain threats, which is shown in coordinated United Nations sanctions against North Korea since 2016. However, a negative impact of rogue states on global order is heightened global insecurity, which is shown in North Korea's repeated missile tests since 2017. Liberal economies, the rule of law, and democracy have developed over time and spread across the global political system. Liberal economies are economic systems where market forces, private ownership, and competition largely determine the production and distribution of goods and services. Liberal economies have developed by evolving through historical stages linked to changes in trade, industry, and state intervention. Liberal economies first developed by the growth of free trade and limited government involvement during early industrialization. Liberal economies then developed by expanding global trade networks and financial systems during the 20th century. Liberal economies later developed by adapting to globalization through deregulation, technological innovation, and international economic institutions. Liberal economies have spread across the globe as states adopt free markets to encourage growth, investment, and integration into the global economy. This is shown in the United Kingdom joining the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership in 2023 to expand free trade links. Rule of law is the principle that all individuals and institutions are subject to and accountable under the law, applied equally and fairly. Rule of law has developed by progressing through stages that strengthened legal limits on power and protected individual rights. Rule of law first developed by establishing legal codes that restricted arbitrary rule by monarchs or elites. Rule of law then developed by creating independent courts and legal procedures to enforce laws consistently. Rule of law later developed by embedding human rights protections into national constitutions and international law. Rule of law have spread across the globe as international institutions and agreements promote legal standards and accountability. This is shown in the International Criminal Court issuing arrest warrants related to the Ukraine conflict in 2023, reinforcing international legal norms. Democracy is a system of government where political authority comes from the people through participation and representation. Democracy has developed by advancing through stages that expanded political rights and accountability. Democracy first developed by extending voting rights beyond elites to wider sections of society. Democracy then developed by strengthening representative institutions and competitive political parties. Democracy later developed by protecting civil liberties and ensuring free media and independent oversight. Democracy has spread across the globe as international pressure, education, and institutions encourage popular participation in government. This is shown in Ukraine being granted European Union candidate status in 2022 due to commitments to democratic reforms and governance standards. There are many ways the changing relationships and actions of states address global issues involving conflict, poverty, human rights, and the environment. The changing relationships of states, in relation to power, address and resolve global issues involving conflict by forming alliances and collective security arrangements to deter aggression and coordinate responses. The changing relationships of states, in relation to developments, address and resolve global issues involving conflict by using international institutions, diplomacy, and shared norms to manage disputes peacefully. This resolves global issues involving conflict to a greater extent as collective action increases deterrence and legitimacy, which is shown in NATO coordinating military support for Ukraine following Russia's invasion in 2022. However, this resolves global issues involving conflict to a greater extent as diplomatic cooperation reduces escalation and encourages negotiation, which is shown in United Nations-led ceasefire efforts during the Israel-Gaza conflict since 2023. The changing relationships of states, in relation to power, address and resolve global issues involving poverty by using influence within international organizations to coordinate aid, debt relief, and development priorities. The changing relationships of states, in relation to developments, address and resolve global issues involving poverty by strengthening cooperation through global institutions, shared targets, and multilateral agreements. This resolves global issues involving poverty to a greater extent as coordinated international action increases funding and support for the poorest states, which is shown in the World Bank approving a record replenishment of the International Development Association in 2021 to support low-income countries after COVID. However, this resolves global issues involving poverty to a greater extent as collective debt management prevents economic collapse and allows states to invest in development, which is shown in the G20 Common Framework for Debt Relief introduced in 2020 for heavily indebted countries. The changing relationships of states, in relation to power, address and resolve global issues involving human rights by using diplomatic influence and alliances to pressure states to comply with international standards. The changing relationships of states, in relation to developments, address and resolve global issues involving human rights by strengthening international institutions, treaties, and shared norms. This resolves global issues involving human rights to a greater extent as collective pressure increases accountability and legitimacy, which is shown in coordinated Western sanctions against Russian officials for human rights abuses in Ukraine since 2022. However, this resolves global issues involving human rights to a greater extent as dialogue and engagement encourage gradual reform, which is shown in renewed United Nations human rights monitoring in Afghanistan since 2021. The changing relationships of states, in relation to power, address and resolve global issues involving the environment by forming international agreements where powerful states set targets and influence collective action. The changing relationships of states, in relation to developments, address and resolve global issues involving the environment by increasing cooperation through global institutions, scientific sharing, and environmental diplomacy. This resolves global issues involving the environment to a greater extent as collective commitments encourage coordinated reductions in emissions, which is shown in countries strengthening climate pledges at COP26 in 2021. However, this resolves global issues involving the environment to a greater extent as flexible cooperation allows states at different stages of development to participate, which is shown in the Paris Agreement being reaffirmed and expanded upon by most states since 2015. The changing actions of states, in relation to power, address and resolve global issues involving conflict by using military intervention, sanctions, and deterrence to influence the behavior of other states. The changing actions of states, in relation to developments, address and resolve global issues involving conflict by prioritizing mediation, peacekeeping, and humanitarian assistance alongside force. This resolves global issues involving conflict to a greater extent as decisive action can limit further violence and weaken aggressors, which is shown in international sanctions imposed on Russia since 2022. However, this resolves global issues involving conflict to a greater extent as long-term stability is built through negotiation and reconstruction, which is shown in African Union and United Nations peacekeeping operations in Mali during the last decade. The changing actions of states, in relation to power, address and resolve global issues involving poverty by using economic strength to provide aid, investment, and preferential trade access. The changing actions of states, in relation to developments, address and resolve global issues involving poverty by focusing on long-term development through education, infrastructure, and sustainable growth policies. This resolves global issues involving poverty to a greater extent as targeted investment stimulates growth and job creation, which is shown in China's Belt and Road projects contributing to poverty reduction in parts of Asia and Africa during the last decade. However, this resolves global issues involving poverty to a greater extent as direct humanitarian assistance protects vulnerable populations during crises, which is shown in international emergency aid provided to countries facing food insecurity following the COVID pandemic since 2020. The changing actions of states, in relation to power, address and resolve global issues involving human rights by imposing sanctions, withdrawing aid, or using conditional trade to influence behavior. The changing actions of states, in relation to developments, address and resolve global issues involving human rights by supporting civil society, monitoring abuses, and promoting legal reform. This resolves global issues involving human rights to a greater extent as targeted measures deter abuses and support victims, which is shown in the United States using the Global Magnitsky Act to sanction individuals responsible for abuses since 2017. However, this resolves global issues involving human rights to a greater extent as long-term protection depends on institutional reform rather than punishment alone, which is shown in European Union-funded rule of law and human rights programs in the Western Balkans over the last decade. The changing actions of states, in relation to power, address and resolve global issues involving the environment by using economic influence, sanctions, and investment to shape environmental behavior. The changing actions of states, in relation to developments, address and resolve global issues involving the environment by investing in renewable energy, green technology, and sustainable development policies. This resolves global issues involving the environment to a greater extent as state-led investment accelerates the transition away from fossil fuels, which is shown in the European Union expanding its Green Deal policies since 2019. However, this resolves global issues involving the environment to a greater extent as long-term progress depends on domestic policy change rather than pressure alone, which is shown in China increasing renewable energy capacity and reducing coal growth since 2020. Thank you for watching this video on power and developments. I'll see you in the next one.